Hello everyone, welcome back to Foot Forecast, and in today's video I'm going to be ranking every Premier League team's January transfer window, and the side I'm going to start off with is Arsenal. And on the end, they brought no players in this January, and they sold Zinchenko and they loaned out Ethan Nwaneri. And Arsenal are currently flying top of the Premier League, but I think there is a couple of things they could have done in January. The first thing was the midfield. Mikel Merino is out for the season, so I think Arsenal could have used an extra midfielder. Because if you look at the midfield cover, they've got Zubimendi, Rice, Odegaard, Norgard, Havertz, Eze, and then potentially Lewis Scully that could play in there. But if you're talking to the two sort of deeper midfielders or the more defensive-minded midfielders, you've got Zubimendi, Rice, Norgard, and Lewis Scully. I think they could have used another one in there. I don't think Arteta particularly trusts Christian Norgard. I don't know if Lewis Scully's ready to sort of start those big games. So if Zubimendi and Rice go down, you could be a bit light in the midfield. In terms of another area of the pitch where I think Arsenal could have signed the player, the left wing, I think they should have gone in for Antoine Semenyo. I think he would have worked perfectly in the Arteta system. He's got a great work rate. He's defensively very good as well as being brilliant going forward, which you obviously need in a left winger. He's very two-footed. He's technically underrated. So I really think Antoine Semenyo would have been the perfect signing for Arsenal this January for £65 million. And I think he would have happily joined Arsenal over Manchester City if they offered him the opportunity. In terms of a ranking, I'm going to give Arsenal a D because I think there were areas where they could improve. It's definitely not an E because I still think Arsenal have done enough to win the league. But if they don't win the league, it may come down to that January transfer window. Then we're on to the next club, which is Aston Villa. And on the end, they brought in Tammy Abraham. They brought in Alisson, which is a young Brazilian winger. They loaned in Douglas Luiz, and then they recalled Leon Bailey. On the out, Marlon Angersand left the club. I think this is a great window from Aston Villa. Abraham coming in for £18 million, a very reasonable fee. And Douglas Luiz coming in, who was a really good player for Unai Emery at Aston Villa previously. And the signing makes so much sense if you consider the fact that John McGinn is out injured. You've also got Kamara out for the season, and Yuri Tielemans is out for a couple of months. So they've added to that midfield, which they needed to do in January. And they've done this while being limited to PSR, and that's why I'm so impressed with this Villa window. The only improvement they could have had is maybe they could have brought in a Conor Gallagher. I think that'd been a really good signing for Aston Villa, but he did decide to go to Spurs, or at least a Conor Gallagher type midfielder, because I think he would have worked really well as sort of a replacement for John McGinn while he's out injured, and some depth for that sort of John McGinn role, which McGinn excels in. And I think Gallagher could have done that really well. In terms of a rating, I'm 100% though still giving Aston Villa an A. This was one of the best transfer windows that I've seen for a club so limited to PSR. Then we're on to the next club, which is Bournemouth. And Bournemouth have brought in three players of the sort of note. Christian Mandos on loan from Lazio, a backup keeper potentially, and someone that could challenge Petrovic. Alex Toff, who's a young midfielder for £13 million, and I would say he's a backup for Alex Scott, and then Ryan for £30 million, who's a young Brazilian winger. And this is the transfer for me that makes this a very good window for Bournemouth, because this is a player that I think is better than Bournemouth. That's what a lot of Brazilian football experts have been saying, that this player is a lot better than Bournemouth's level. And partly the reason why he's willing to join Bournemouth is because of the model of sort of selling players in the future. So he knows that he won't get stuck there, which is the effectiveness of this model. Look, you may let go of top players, but at least you'll be able to continuously bring in good players time after time. And I think he's a great replacement for Semenyo. And he also has an £85 million release clause. So Bournemouth clearly rate him at a very high level. In terms of the transfers that have gone out, Antoine Semenyo has left Bournemouth for £65 million. I think that's a fair value for him, so I don't think they've been ripped off. So I think this is a transfer window for Bournemouth. Then we're on to Brentford, and I don't think Brentford needed to do a lot. I think they addressed the one position which I think was maybe a bit of a concern, which would be a backup striker for Igor Thiago, and they did this for Kaya Foro, a young striker. He hasn't played a lot at Belgium, which is where he was, and he's very much, I think, a backup for Thiago. And they'll be hoping he can develop into a top striker and eventually probably take over from Igor Thiago. Brentford have an excellent record actually of signing number 9s when they lose them. You could also play Kevin Schade up front if that Kaio Fora isn't ready and Thiago gets injured. Then we're on to Brighton, and Brighton haven't done a lot. They recalled O'Reilly and they brought Pascal Gross back to the club. A couple of decent transfers for Brighton. In terms of players going out, a lot of players going out on loan, but no one really significant. The good thing about this window for Brighton is they've just added a bit of midfield depth. I don't think it's a particularly good window. I don't think it's a particularly bad window. I'm just going to give this a standard C. Then we're on to Burnley, and I actually like Burnley's one incoming in James Ward-Prowse because he can be effective from set pieces. That might be an area where Burnley can get at some sides. But my problem with this transfer window is it's not ambitious enough to stay in the division. You're basically accepting the fact that you are going down. But I also don't think it's a window where they're prepared for the Championship particularly well, because if they were preparing for the Championship well, I think they would have gone and made a couple of signings that would do really well in the Championship for the next season. And they have to go an E for this. This was one of the worst windows. Then we've got Chelsea, and I was disappointed with Chelsea's transfer window, to say the least. They recalled Mamadou Sarr, and then they've let go of Tyreek George and Disasi out on loan. And then Raheem Sterling has mutually terminated his contract. My problem with this window is, first of all, you haven't backed Liam Rossigna, who's the new manager, and there's no excuse for this because there's a load of positions where you could upgrade with Chelsea. For example, you could improve on Robert Sanchez if you wanted to in this window. I don't think that was an absolute priority, but a position where I think Chelsea needed to buy a player was centre-half. I still think they really lack experience across the board and in this position, and I'm not convinced by any of the centre-halves Chelsea really have. I think Chalobah and Fofana are decent, but they're not excellent. I think Colwell's good, but he's currently injured for 4 months, and I think Chelsea need to go and buy another good centre-half. Or they could have bought an extra midfielder, a midfielder that can play deeper, because I think Chelsea's best midfield right now is Caicedo, then another midfielder, and then Enzo Fernandez is the most advanced midfielder, and then you use Palmer and Estevao as your wingers. I think that's probably Chelsea's best side right now, because Enzo Fernandez is way better when he's further forward. We've seen this all season, and he keeps coming up with some crucial goals. He has to be the most advanced midfielder in the side. In terms of another error in this transfer window, not recalling Nicholas Jackson, I thought this was so obvious in terms of giving them another option up front. I don't think Bayern would really care. They don't have much interest in making this a permanent deal to Bayern Munich. And I think Jackson gives you something different up front. It gives you some pace in behind, and he gives another option of a João Pedro or a Liam Delap, and you also could play João Pedro in behind Nicholas Jackson, which I like to see at Chelsea. So my ranking for Chelsea is an E. So then we've got Crystal Palace, and Crystal Palace have bought Strand Larsen for £48 million. They've loaned in Gassand, and they have bought Johnson for £35 million. On the out, Mark Gahey's left for £20 million. It's been very busy for Crystal Palace, chaotic to say the least. This is one of the most chaotic transfer windows I've seen, especially in January. As well as this, their manager's basically threatening to leave, and he won't be the manager at the end of the season. In my opinion, they did spend money, and at least they tried to address the squad depth, and they tried to address this further by trying to get Dwight McNeil, but they were unable to make this deal happen, which is at least a positive. They were trying to make signings happen, but some of them just fell through. But at the same time, that's a negative because clearly they still feel like they're short, and I couldn't quite work out where they felt they were short with McNeil. And the only position I could really see which maybe they think they're short in is the left wing back. I know he's going to use McNeil as a left wing back, or maybe long term as sort of a winger, but it wouldn't work in the system for Oliver Glasner that he uses right now with Dwight McNeil. I was also shocked to see that Dwight McNeil is 26 years old. It feels like McNeil's been around for absolutely ages, but anyway, he is 26 years old currently. In terms of the actual signings, I don't think any of these signings are great deals. For example, I think they overpaid for Strand Larsen. I think that's a good player, but they're paid probably, I'd say, about £10 million at least over what I would consider a good deal or a fair deal. But if Strand Larsen performs like he was for Wolves last season, then that will be a fair deal for sure. And he'll probably score 10, 15 goals at least, you'd think, for Crystal Palace. My main concern with this transfer window is the fact that they didn't get the replacement in for Mark Gahey, which felt like an absolute must. One of Crystal Palace's best players, and they only got £20 million for him. So that is concerning for Crystal Palace. So this could cost Crystal Palace in the Premier League. I don't see them getting relegated, but it could cost them in terms of winning that Europa Conference League. Because I can't see them being relegated, and I don't see them pushing Europe, I think it's probably a D for Palace. I think they could have done better business in this transfer window, but I don't think it's going to result in anything too bad for them. Another problem they now have got is Jean-Philippe Mateta, who now is going to have surgery for 4 months, and they were unable to ship him off to Milan because he failed his medical. Then we're on to the next club, which is Everton. And Everton were pretty quiet on the players that came into the club. Harrison Armstrong was recalled, and Tyreek George came on loan from Chelsea. And no one left the club. Dwight McNeil nearly did, but he remained at Everton. Do I think Everton could have done more in this transfer window? Yes. I'm not quite sure about their PSR constraints, but I think they could have at least looked at some loan deals. For example, I think they could have improved in the fullback position. I think you could have got better fullback options than O'Brien and Brentford. They're good players, but I think they're better in the centre halves, especially Jared Brentford. You need him playing as a left centre half, not a left back. Tyreek George is a decent signing. I quite like Tyreek George, but clearly they wanted better, and that's why they inquired about Harry Wilson. So that's another problem for them. It would have been a great signing if they got Harry Wilson, but that was always going to be unrealistic. But maybe they could have explored other options. Maybe they should have explored the Bournemouth winger that they signed in Ryan. Maybe that would have been a good signing for Everton. And the other position, I think the position they'll be really frustrated they didn't get a number 9. Tiano Barry has been better for Everton recently, but I still think they could use another number 9, and then you would sell Beto, someone like an In-Nesyri, which they were linked with earlier in the window. Then we've got Fulham, and Fulham have been reasonably quiet, but they made one huge signing, and that was Oscar Bob, and they let go of Adama Traore. And this might go down as one of the best purchases of this January. This is a top signing. Oscar Bob is a huge talent, and for only £30 million, I actually think it's very good value for money. The only reason he's left is because City have signed so many wingers, and because he broke his leg early at the start of the season. If Oscar Bob doesn't do this, he could be starting for Manchester City. So the fact that Fulham picked up this player is so impressive, and I think he will go down as one of the best signings in this January. They also looked at signing Pepe from PSV, but they were unable to get the signing over the line because PSV couldn't find a replacement. It would have been a useful signing, but he is currently injured and out for a month, so they would have had to wait a month to sign the player. But I don't think it's a huge problem because you've still got Raul Jimenez, who's a good number 9 that can play up front. For the ranking, I'm going to put this in A because I think Oscar Bob's that good of a signing for a club like Fulham. Then we're on to Leeds, and Leeds have loaned in Buonanotte, and on the out, Jack Harrison has left Leeds. A very quiet window. I think they could have brought in a couple of players at least. I think they could have definitely upgraded in the keeper position. Leeds don't have a reliable keeper right now, and that's definitely going to take down this transfer window ranking. In terms of other positions, maybe you could improve up front. And Leeds did agree with this because they looked at trying to sign Jorgen Strand-Larsen. I think for Leeds, I'm going to rank this as a D. It's not quite an E because I don't think this is going to be a reason why they get relegated. I still think Leeds will stay in the division. But if they get relegated, I think they'll be looking at this window and saying, we could have done more. Because I think Carl Darlow will be at fault for some goals for Leeds come the end of the season. And that is my main concern. So then we're on to Liverpool, and Liverpool have done absolutely nothing this January. And I don't think that's a huge surprise considering the amount they spent in the summer. But then they ended up buying Jeremy Dequette right at the end for £60 million. So there's definitely some money there to play with. And what I would say is, surely Liverpool could have found a squad player to buy for £10 or £15 million to cover for the rest of the season. Because if they don't get Champions League football because of this, then they will be regretting that hugely. And I think it could be a real problem. If Van Dijk or Konate go down, all you've got to rely on is Joe Gomez, and Joe Gomez is likely to get injured if he plays sort of more than 10 games with his injury record. One of those signings that they could have brought in, which they couldn't manage to do, was Gertrude, which I think would have been a top signing for Liverpool. I think it would have been a really good squad option. He could have replaced Joe Gomez long term as the centre-half / right-back cover, and that's the two positions where Liverpool have currently got no depth. So I think that's the big miss for Liverpool in this January window. There are also other positions they could have looked at, maybe a 6, but I think that is summer business, or maybe even a winger, and then you let go of Mo Salah. But once again, I think that is summer transfer business. And I think at the end of the day, you've got to put Liverpool in E because they just simply haven't done anything. And I think there were options, as I already said, Gertruda. If you asked to bring him in earlier in the window, I think that gets done because I think Sunderland then go, okay, we've got time to get a replacement. Denzel Dumfries, maybe if you try that earlier, you bring him in from Inter Milan. There are also definitely centre-halves on the market that you could look at, out and out centre-halves for probably 15, 20 million pounds. But Liverpool have decided not to do this. They've decided to take the risk. And I understand they don't want to be too risky with this window because what if Slot gets sacked? Then where you go from there? But as I was saying, just go get someone in on loan or go get someone for 10, 15 million pounds and then you probably consider it a decent window. So then we're on to Manchester City, and this is the most obvious, eh? They bought Antoine Semenyo and Mark Gahey for a combined £85 million. The Gahey deal was an absolute bargain for £20 million. I don't care the fact he's on whatever, like 300k, 200k a week, whatever it is. It's still a very good deal to bring Mark Gahey in for only £20 million. And it's exactly what they needed because they needed centre-half depth with John Stones, Vardy and Ruben Dias all being out injured. As well as this, Max Lane was also recalled from Watford. In terms of outgoings, Ortega left, that's fine. You've got Trafford as your backup. And Oscar Bob left for £30 million. And look, it's quite a small fee for Oscar Bob, but they're thinking long term here. There's a sell-on clause in the contracts and there's a matching clause. So if a club offers, let's say, £60 million, if City match that fee, then they should still be able to get the player of Oscar Bob, because I would be shocked if he didn't want to go back to City. And what I do like about the signing of Semenyo is he offers some physicality. He's a top winger, he's two-footed, and he's actually technically underrated, which is really important for a Guardiola system. And I really hope that Pep gets the best out of him. That's what's going to be the difference, I think, here. If Pep gets the best out of him, then this will be a very good signing. If he doesn't give him enough freedom, then we may be looking at just a decent signing, like a Jack Grealish sort of signing. In terms of Mark Gahey, I mean, I don't think you can go wrong with that fee. So, of course, City will be an A. Then we're on to Manchester United, and it's very similar to Liverpool. Nothing on the incomings, nothing on the outgoings. There's some doubt around the manager because United don't know if Carrick will be staying as the manager. I think the one difference between United and Liverpool is that United only have one competition, so you can understand maybe not looking at sort of depth signings, but I still think there were opportunities to improve the squad. Maybe a right back. You could consider a left back, considering Dorgu's so far been played as a winger and he's also out injured, so he's not even an option there. And they're only left with Shaw and Malacia. Malacia is very injury prone. Shaw has been injury prone in the past. And the obvious one is the two midfielders. I definitely think you could have improved or at least given another option than just Mainu and Casemiro. If you wanted a sort of backup for Mainu or someone that could compete with Mainu, Douglas Luiz on loan would have been a great shout, who's ended up at Aston Villa. And I'm sure if they had a look around, they could have found sort of a deeper midfielder. Ruben Neves was linked earlier in the window. Those are the sort of deals I think that United needed to explore and look at. And at the end of the day, even if Ruben Amorim was still the manager, United weren't going to spend it. It's not just down to Carrick being the manager, because he said in his last press conference that was one of his frustrations, the fact that he wasn't able to sign players in the midfield in January. He stated this. So I think for that reason, you've got to give United an E. Then we're on to Newcastle, and no one in the incomings, no one on the outgoings. And in fairness to Newcastle, they do have some PSR constraints. That is well known. But once again, could have they done more? I think so. Because if you look at a club like Aston Villa, Villa found a way to do it. They signed Abraham and Douglas Luiz, recalled Leon Bailey. So there are ways around doing it by finding cheaper alternatives in the market. And I think Newcastle clearly do need a midfielder. I think they could use a creative team to go to that next stage, or they could actually use a 6 that then allows Sandro Tonali and Bruno G to get further up the pitch and be those more creative sort of 8s. And I think that's more what Eddie Howe would like to do in January. And I think that's something Newcastle should consider in the future. You could have looked at Ruben Neves to be that 6 potentially, and I think that midfield 3 would work really well. I think the reason why I'm not going to put this in E is because I can understand those PSR constraints, so I'm going to put Newcastle in D. Then we're on to Nottingham Forest, and as usual, Forest were active in the transfer window. They brought in Lorenzo Luca, which I actually really like as a signing, and I think this is probably what brings this ranking up. Luca is basically a Chris Wood region, but he's a lot younger, and as well as this, it's just a loan move so they can see how good he really is. Then they brought Luca Netz, which is some cover at left back, which was needed for Forest, and they brought Stefan Ortega in goal for about, I think, 800k. It was a very good deal, whatever it was. It was nothing. And that's because John Victor's out for the season, and I'd also trust Ortega as my backup more than John Victor. I actually think there's a chance Ortega could push Sells for a starting position at some points. In terms of outgoings, Kalamadu left on the loan. It's disappointing he hasn't worked out the French striker / sort of winger, and he looked to be a real talent when he came in, but it just hasn't suited the Sean Dyche system. I do like this window from Forest because I think they've just sort of picked up a couple of players which are just really good depth, and I think this is sort of what you do in January with these sorts of clubs. I think what stops us being an A is the fact that they couldn't pick up a midfielder. They were desperate for a midfielder. They inquired about Hayden Hackney from Middlesbrough. They put in about 3 bids from Ingles from Celtic, but didn't get him once. And the reason why this is because actually Forest don't have a huge amount of depth in that midfield, at least quality depth, because Dominguez plays as a left midfielder, so I can understand why they wanted this extra depth. But overall, they've strengthened well across the other positions. I'm going to give Forest a B. Then we're on to Sunderland, and Sunderland made a couple of signings, Nilson Angelo and Tabaya. I haven't seen either of these players play at all, but what I can talk about is what Sunderland needed in January. And if you had to pick out a couple of positions where Sunderland have been a bit weaker this season, you would have picked out those. And if you had to pick out a couple of positions where Sunderland may have been lacking a bit of quality, I would say the 2 wingers. Alborg also came in a goalkeeper, very much a backup, and that is because Nathan Patterson moved to Millwall on deadline day, and Simon Odingra moved on deadline day as well. I think this is probably a B window for Sunderland. They've addressed the position where I thought they were most weak. Then we're on to Spurs, and I'm a bit disappointed by Spurs. They bought Conor Gallagher, who I actually quite like Conor Gallagher. I think he's a very good sort of all-round midfielder, but I'm just not convinced it's the sort of midfielder that Spurs actually needed. I think Spurs needed a midfielder that was elite in progressing the ball up the pitch, which Gallagher actually just isn't. He's a very good box-to-box. He provides high energy, high pressing, but Spurs have similar midfield types to him. For example, you have Papamata Sarr, who can also do this role. There's other options. What Spurs were really lacking is a midfielder that's elite at progressing the ball up the pitch, because that's been their problem all season. If you look at their progressive numbers this season, it's absolutely astonishing how bad they are, and that is mainly due to the manager in Thomas Frank, but they definitely still could have used a different option in there. In terms of other incomings, Souza came in. He's a left back, which is unlikely to play. I don't really get the signing because I think right now Spurs need now signings and not signings for the future. In terms of people leaving the club, Brennan Johnson has left to Crystal Palace for £35 million. I think that's a pretty good sale for Spurs. They have actually taken a loss because they bought him for more, but he hasn't really excelled at Spurs. He did obviously score that massive Europa League final goal, so he will always be cherished at Spurs. In terms of where I think they could have improved the side, which they didn't, I think first of all they could have bought a first choice left back. I think first of all they could have bought a first choice left back, and they were interested in doing this. They were linked with Andy Robertson, and it seemed to be quite concrete interest in him, and they didn't manage to buy any left back. And I felt this was a really important deal with the fact that Destiny Odogi is very injury prone. Jed Spencer's decent at left back, but I do think there are disadvantages to having a right-footed left back. And Porro is playing so many minutes where you actually need Spence to be able to cover in at right wing back as well, or right back, depending on what formation Thomas Frank is playing at Spurs. And the other left back covering, Ben Davies, is currently injured, and I think he's out for this season. The other position you could potentially improve Spurs is the striker position, but in January that was always unlikely. I think I'm going to give Spurs a D. They've at least brought in a couple of players, the main one being Conor Gallagher. I don't think it's exactly what Spurs need, but it's still a decent player to bring in. So then we're on to West Ham, and first of all they brought in Pablo Felipe for £20 million. And look, I don't think he's been awful so far, but I'm just not convinced that this is what the West Ham currently needed in terms of that second striker / sort of team position. I think that's a big risk buying a player like this who just isn't proven at all. They then bought Tate Castellanos for £30 million. I mean, I still think West Ham have been absolutely ripped off by this fee because he didn't do well in Serie A with Lazio. And overall, he's just not that good of a player. And if he's struggling to perform at Lazio, it's so unlikely that he'll be able to perform for West Ham in a relegation battle in the Premier League. So I really don't think that transfer is going to work out. Then we've got Adama Traore on loan. Traore, I mean, he's a decent squad option once again. A player you could sort of bring on for the last 10 minutes, but nothing special. Then we've got Axel Disasi. I mean, I don't mind the signing. I think he can be all right for West Ham. I think the key thing where they've done well is actually the sales. They've sold Lucas Paquetá for £40 million, I think it was, which I think is a really good fee for him, because I don't think he's a sort of player you want in a relegation battle. And then Lewis Guilherme for £17 million. So combined, they've sold about £60 million worth of players, and they've brought in about 60. Good sales, but I'm just not convinced by the signings. And the key question for West Ham is, do I think that's enough to stay up? No, I think they needed to do more. I think they need to look at better options, more proven options to keep them in the division. And I don't think they've done enough to stay up. So I'm going to give West Ham a D. The reason why it's not an E is because at least they have tried to stay up, but they needed to do this at the start of the season. And if they go down, it will come down to the fact that they did their transfer business too late. Then we're on to Wolverhampton Wanderers. And Wolves were just preparing for the Championship in this transfer window. That was obvious. But I actually really like Wolves' business. They brought in Adam Armstrong and Angel Gomez for both for £7 million. Angel Gomez for £7 million is an absolute bargain. He's a better player than he's shown at Marseille, I think, has Angel Gomez. And previously, he was getting into England squads. He was talked about, could he even be sort of a squad player at the World Cup for England? He was impressive when he was playing for England, and he was really good at Lille in Ligue 1. So I think this is a top signing, one of the bargains of the January transfer window. And most likely he's going to be playing in the Championship, or you probably flip him for sort of £30 million. So either way, I think this is a great signing. I can't really see this one not working out, and it's not a huge risk at all. In terms of why you've still got your Premier League status, while players do have the opportunity to play in the Premier League, you can still bring in these sort of players for pretty good fees. The other signing I like is Adam Armstrong. I think, once again, this is a Championship proven striker. He does well for you in the Championship. Not that great in the Premier League, we know this, but Wolves aren't staying in the division, so it doesn't really matter. As well as this, they got £48 million for Strand Larsen. So they've done really well to get that much for Strand Larsen. Overall, it's not signings that are going to keep you in the division. But in terms of preparing for the Championship, I don't think you could have done much more. So I'm going to give Wolves a B. I think they should be happy with their business. Let me know your thoughts on these rankings. And if you enjoy this video, go subscribe to the channel as well as liking the video.